Thank you, everyone, for being here. According to many scholars, England became the world's first modern financial capitalist economy during the early modern period. Historians and social scientists have highlighted the years, in particular 1690 to about 1730, as a crucial period of transformation that has become known as England's financial revolution. Scholars have usually focused on the formation of institutions that facilitated this development, such as the establishment of the Bank of England, the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, right here, the modern building, which was created by Act of Parliament in 1694. Also the creation of new investment schemes, companies, stock exchanges, insurance companies, which were all driven by the expansion of credit and the creation of the national debt by the English government. Often the financial revolution is presented as a rational series of events that progressed relatively smoothly over a few decades with little regard for the messy realities of these new financial opportunities. History, of course, is full of these messy realities, and that's what historians like to focus on. Some historians have started to show us that the financial revolution was hardly a series of rational economic events stemming from political certainty and stability. This was especially true during its formative decades, when a number of unsuccessful schemes of investment, both public and private, far outnumbered successful ones. This uncertainty of the financial revolution, I think, needs to be taken seriously, and this is the focus of my research. Indeed, set amidst international wars, particularly against France, a crisis in the value of the currency that circulated in England, recurrent credit crunches, amongst other things, it's actually a wonder that the institutions of investment that we associate with the financial revolution, such as the Bank of England, which is of course still around today, survived. In addition, there was widespread fear and distrust of the so-called moneyed interest, the men who ran these corporations and banks, and their wealth and the political power that they had. Why then did the financial revolution in England succeed? I'm interested how and why the financial revolution survived these crises by looking at the political culture that developed surrounding these new investment opportunities. I investigate how people in early modern Britain attempted to understand, to come to terms with what became the origins of modern capitalism. How and why did people place cultural and political as well as monetary value on these new institutions of investment? Why was it that despite the distrust of the so-called moneyed interest that controlled banks and joint stock corporations, did these institutions over time gain the trust of the population? In other words, how did people experience the financial revolution, and what role did these experiences play in contributing to its survival? Now, I used my support from the Humanities Center this summer to begin researching this project in various archives in London, specifically the British Library, the National Archives, and the archives of the Bank of England. I sat in the basement of that building for a couple of weeks. Because I was there for a short period of time, I decided to focus my research on the South Sea bubble, in which the price of South Sea Company stock rose to unsustainable levels for a few brief months in 1720. And it caused sort of this crisis, not only a financial crisis, but sort of a crisis of identity and morality in England and Britain. And William Hogarth, one of the more famous engravers of the 18th century, printed a number of essentially cartoons or engravings that point out the flaws and how terrible the South Sea bubble was, and this is one of the more famous ones. There's a Wheel of Fortune in the middle. You can see St. Paul's in the background. The monument to the fire of London in 1666 is right there. Most importantly, in this corner right here in your lower right-hand corner is trade emaciated and neglected. And so the South Sea Company is supposed to be a trading company, but instead it's doing all these nefarious things. The South Sea bubble is one of the more infamous events in early modern British history. It tends to be taught in both history and economics classes, really from high school and college levels. And it's been widely studied and generally considered to be one of the more turbulent events of the era. I'm interested in how and why England's economy survived the bursting of the South Sea bubble. First, I want to give just a brief history of the South Sea Company itself. It's actually a relatively new company. When the bubble bursts in 1720, it had only been founded or formed in 1711 by Queen Anne and her trusted advisor, Lord Treasurer Sir Robert Harley, who became the Earl of Oxford. He founds this company in order to solve a looming credit crisis caused by the nation's enormous war debts in the early 18th century. Britain had been fighting France for the better part of 2 decades, and the nation's debts were staggering, upwards of £9 million at the time, which is about £1 billion sterling in today's money, so a lot of money. Creditors such as soldiers and sailors owed back pay, or suppliers to the armed forces whose bills the government had yet to pay, could have these debts exchanged for stock in the new company. That was the idea behind the creation of this company. As an incentive to investors and creditors, the new joint stock corporation was established with a monopoly on trade to and from the Spanish colonies in America. Sir Robert Harley knew full well that not only would peace soon be declared between Britain and France, ending the War of Spanish Succession, but that the terms of the peace would be commercially beneficial to Britain by including the asiento, which was the exclusive contract to provide the Spanish colonies with enslaved Africans. This contract had promised to be especially lucrative, as the Spanish needed slaves and were not direct participants in the slave trade themselves. And this also was an indication of the hold that the idea of the South Seas, and particularly Spanish America, had on the British imagination. Spanish America was viewed as this just bottomless source of wealth, with all of the silver mines in Peru and Mexico. And wouldn't it be wonderful if Britain could somehow get a chunk of that? And so this was the idea behind the South Sea Company, getting Spanish wealth in part by providing the Spanish colonies with enslaved Africans. As one supporter at the time remarked, quote, "I must admit it is to be an uncommon method to raise the public credit by exposing to the world the nation's immense debt," which they did. They said, hey, we have a debt of £9 million, which usually wasn't advertised. Yet, what ill consequence can it be when the vast ocean of the South Seas and the infinite treasures of America are assigned for that satisfaction? Government creditors would earn money on their investments, and the nation's debt would be funded from the vast riches at the heart of Spanish-American trade, including the slave trade. Although establishing a successful trade with the Spanish in the New World would prove rather elusive for the South Sea Company, not least because the English and the Spanish continued to distrust each other and would frequently declare war against each other, it continued to attract investors throughout the 1710s. At the end of the decade, the company's directors developed a scheme to attract further investment and drive up profits by servicing the nation's debts further, particularly a large pool of annuities that the government wished to be rid of, through exchanging these debts for new issuances of company stock, which would be accepted by Parliament in early 1720. In order for the company to make money, the price of stock had to rise. So the directors and other large investors started swapping large pools of new shares in order to influence the market and drive up the price of stock. Over the course of the spring and summer of 1720, the company issued 4 new subscriptions of its stock amidst, quote, "a background of frenzied speculation." This is the quote of a historian of the financial revolution. The short story is that the frenzy ceased in August, and company share prices from then began their precipitous decline and fall. By December, the South Sea bubble had completely burst. Parliament set to work later that month, beginning an investigation into the nefarious activities of those who orchestrated the shady scheme. The inquiry uncovered the corrupt actions of a number of high-placed politicians, a number of whom were forced to resign. In addition, under the leadership of Sir Robert Walpole, soon to be named First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer, a rescue package or bailout of the South Sea Company was orchestrated. They did not use the term bailout. I'm using the term bailout. And other historians have also used this term. But they did use the term rescue. There was sort of a necessity to rescue. A bailout of the company was considered necessary to save the nation's credit and preserve political and social stability. This was especially crucial to the reigning monarch, King George I, who had only been in power since 1714 when Queen Anne passed away, when he came from Hanover, Germany, to become King of Great Britain at the invitation of Parliament because he was the next Protestant in line to the throne, even though there were dozens and dozens of Catholics in front of him. As Walpole himself wrote, quote, "The public security and the restoring and establishing public credit in which your Majesty's government is so highly concerned are first to be consulted." This was an age of rebellions, and plenty of people viewed George I's rule with skepticism, if not downright hostility, and therefore the bubble presented itself as an opportunity for the king and his government to be seen as rescuing not only the South Sea Company, but Britain itself. So the bailout, or the rescue package, involved most directly the Bank of England and the East India Company. The East India, and these are contemporary drawings, engravings of the old buildings of those two corporations. The East India Company, a much older institution, had been trading to and from Asia for well over a century by the time of the South Sea Bubble. And in early 1721, over 1 million pounds of South Sea stock was engrafted, that was the word that they used, or added onto East India Company stock. In other words, the bad stock was absorbed by a good, stable trading company. In February of 1721, a further engraftment was made to East India stock, as well as the stock of the Bank of England. As I mentioned earlier, the Bank of England had been founded in 1694 by an act of Parliament. The bank's primary purpose was to assist the government in funding wars against France. It frequently loaned the government money through its subscriptions, through its depositors, basically. By the time of the South Sea Bubble, the bank had become the most important financial institution in the country. Thousands of average people had deposited their money in the bank, and again, the government regularly relied on the bank for loans to sustain its international war efforts. It is therefore not surprising that Walpole and the government would turn to the bank in this desperate time. And throughout 1721 and 22, the bank was called upon numerous times to continue assisting the South Sea Company and rescue the nation's finances. An especially large engraftment was orchestrated in the summer of 1722, in which the bank would issue new stock to buy up old stock in the South Sea Company. Now, this isn't as straightforward as it might seem. First, these rescue deals essentially required the South Sea Company to lay bare its losses, its lack of capital, which could have contributed to further economic instability. According to another contemporary observer, a well-connected English diplomat, this was actually the point of the plan. He wrote a letter to Walpole in the summer of 1722 as the details of this deal between the South Sea Company and the Bank of England are being worked out.
But the idea of this is that these senators are supposed to buy into the
That was the idea.
Did they?
Yes, a lot of them did. A lot of them did. Most people, of course, who are subscribing to, especially the trading companies like the South Sea Company or the East India Company is kind of a different beast, but they tend to be sort of middling, wealthier people. Bank of England actually attracts a broader segment of society than you might expect. Its initial offering in 1694 attracts over 3,000 investors, or depositors basically, who have a little something to deposit. So again, we're not talking poverty-stricken people, but it's not entirely the elites. It's not entirely sort of the upper crust of English society. They're centered in and around London, although they are everywhere in England. But it's a broader segment of the population than you might at first expect, actually.
Oh, sure. I'm wondering, do you also look at the influence of the media? Because there are newspapers for the first time
Or like,
and there are people who can read them.
Right.
And I mean, I
Yeah.
often think about how I don't like to look at my own stocks because if I keep looking at them every day, I'll freak out because
Yeah.
they're all, but people freaked out, right? I
Yes.
mean, because they could read what was going on and because,
or they could go to the Royal Exchange and hear about what was going on, or they could go to the coffee shop and hear about what was going on. I mean, there's this whole culture that develops around the financial revolution. Actually, a number of literary scholars have been focusing on that in recent years, about the newspapers that circulate and sort of contribute to this not frenzy, but also the panic. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
No,
Oh.
you can finish answering.
Oh.
I'm just going to change the...
Oh, right, okay. Who contribute to the panic, right? So there is a lot of concern on the part of, say, a Walpole to be like, maybe we shouldn't, there are attempts on the part of the government to regulate print and, to very little avail in the early 18th century. What they do try to crack down on are crowds, riots that occur in the wake of these sorts of things. Again, we think of investors, especially in this time period, as probably being among the wealthier segments of society, and they by and large were. But on the other hand, there are artisans and workers who are, protesting a variety of things against the government, lack of pay, for example, whatever it is, economic insecurity, and a lot of their riots or protests will begin at places like the Stock Exchange or the Bank of England, and then they'll march through the rest of the city. Or they'll attack the house of the governor of the East India Company. It is scary when you think about it, but media, images in particular, play a big role in contributing to that sort of culture.